Hello, this is Alex Gibney, and this is my commentary on the film, an assortment of random thoughts and hopefully instructive background materials for your listening pleasure. The film starts with a Tom Waits song, What's He Building? Tom Waits is the perfect music for this film because he has a kind of tragicomic quality to his music. You know, the very sad tunes will often go with happy lyrics and vice versa, but What's He Building was so great. It's a meditation on a neighbor next door, some mad scientist who's building something strange. It's very funny, but also very dark. And it also, in a very direct way, asks the fundamental question about Enron. What's he building? As if, it's asking about Jeff Skilling or Andy Fastow or Ken Lay. What are they doing in there? These aerials of Houston, I think, are extraordinarily beautiful, a really nice use of HD. And here you have some of the characters talking about it. But the glistening skyline, those are the two Enron towers right there. And there's something about HD that really captured the sheen of Enron, this kind of glistening company. One of the great things about this aerial sequence, too, that Maurice Alberti so elegantly shot, is the way we turned it upside down. And that was the way Enron was. Everything, in the end, turned topsy-turvy. And so this image at the beginning, without any comment until now, is all about that whole idea of it turning upside down.
Smoke and mirrors.
I like this transition very much. We always go in the film from glistening shots of skyscrapers to newsreels of what was actually happening. It helps to undergird this idea of what is real and what is a kind of bizarre stage set. I love putting this interview with Bethany up front, too, because when people first see her, they always remark how they didn't know what she was doing. Such a pretty young woman in this very big, high-octane film about finance, but she earns your respect by the end of the film. Now, this song was absolutely key to me. It's Billie Holiday's version of God Bless the Child, and like a lot of the Tom Waits music, it has that tragicomic quality. I mean, it's such a haunting, beautiful melody, and yet the lyrics themselves are so very dark. All about how the strong lord it over the weak. This sequence was much talked about in the cutting room. It ends up being a recreation of a suicide, and as you find out later, it was that of a man named Cliff Baxter. But the fact was, when you first see this in the film, you don't know who this person is, and I think that's key to its use and its value and ultimately its effectiveness. This is a person on a late-night drive listening to a haunting sound on the track. And it's important, I think, that we be inside that car, because then we're empathizing with this character. We don't know yet who this character is. And then the gunshot. Now, here's another one of these transitions where then we go in to the newsreel where we hear the announcement of this man's suicide, and we learn for the first time that this man was Cliff Baxter. But I think what's key to that recreation is that you don't know in advance that it's Cliff Baxter. It could be anyone, but the important thing is you're there in a very intimate way, that haunting moment when somebody decides to take their life. These are images of the actual funeral of Cliff Baxter. There's no way of knowing, why anybody commits suicide, but you can sense the cost of this, even with Skilling now answering here. When one human being dies as a result of something like this, you tend to take it much more seriously than endless headlines of losses to investors. I think that, this was a very poignant human tragedy. In many ways, the whole thing, the whole incident of Enron was a very stark human tragedy.
And Cliff came over to my house.
Now, Skilling, throughout this film, gives an enormous amount of testimony before Congress. And you really see his character. There is a very arrogant moment from Skilling. I mean, it's almost as if he's spitting at the congressman. Jeff Skilling is an extraordinarily theatrical person. And you can really see it in the hearings in a way that is very palpable.
I did not do anything wrong that was not in the interest, and all the time that I worked for Enron Corporation, that was in the interest of the shareholders of the company.
Skilling is absolutely convinced even today of his rectitude. That's a very interesting thing, and I give him a lot of credit for going before the House and Senate and taking them on in that way. Now, this space is such an extraordinary space. It took us a long time to get in here. It was so toxic for people that that the company that now owns this space, this empty trading floor of Enron, wouldn't let us in, as if there were somehow ghosts we were going to stir up. But we finally got in, and it is an extraordinary, it's like a spaceship. And you really sense the Titanic elements here. I mean, these two staircases were so much like the staircases I would imagine of the wheelhouse of the Titanic, but this is a Titanic, a spaceship Titanic.
The Titanic, the captain went down with the ship. In Enron, it looks to me like...
The metaphor of the Titanic kept coming back in this film. It wasn't something we imposed on it. Everybody remarked on it. It was so palpable a metaphor.
Skilling, Ken Lay said he hadn't done anything wrong.
You can see from this image just how many people at a certain point were hounding Ken Lay. Always the crews waiting outside of Enron. In the beginning, it was very hard to tie all these different threads together, just enough without giving it all away. The political dimension is something that was very important to Enron, and even as some other investigations play themselves out, particularly the delay investigation, I think the political element of Enron will only increase. But it was important that we touch on it up at the front. It was very hard to figure out how much information to convey early on and what to wait to reveal in the context of a narrative.
Certainly wasn't.
This is an extraordinary story. This is the famous interview with Linda Lay on the Today Show.
In stocks from Enron over the last 4 years. What happened to all that money?
It's gone. It's gone. There's nothing left.
Well, and then the chuckle from Bill Larack in juxtaposition, which stands for the chuckle of everyone. It's hard to believe that all that money is simply gone. Bill Larack is an interesting character, in some circumstances very controversial. In the Enron case, he is key, though, in terms of not only ferreting out a lot of the facts, but also in terms of going after some of the characters who were complicit in the Enron scandal and in the Enron fraud, particularly the banks. And the banks have given now an extraordinary amount of money to the clients of Bill Larack, many of the shareholders.
Of outrage at Lay.
Yeah, there was an extraordinary sense of outrage, and this document kind of captures that.
And how completely artificial the appearance of this company had been.
Now, shredding is an interesting issue at Enron. There were certainly other companies that shredded more, but there was the volume of the shredding, both at Enron and at Arthur Andersen, was really staggering, and these images capture that.
Was Enron the work of a few bad men or the dark shadow of the American...
This idea of the bad apples comes back over and over again, and you see it a lot in Abu Ghraib now.
Lay comes to the story of Enron.
This is the Lay section. The music here was chosen by my great producer, Susan Mutamed, Son of a Preacher Man. It's a great tune and does kind of capture the essence, I think, of Ken Lay.
Lay was a Baptist preacher's son in a family that had been poor all its life.
It's interesting that both Lay and Skilling were not to the manor born. They really came from very poor backgrounds, particularly Lay. You know, that I think is very interesting because it has a lot to say about the American dream.
Sitting on a tractor, dreaming.
Peter Elkind here is one of the two authors of the book, The Smartest Guys in the Room. It was just extraordinary to be able to work with both Peter and Bethany. They really helped me a lot, both in ferreting out people to talk on camera and sometimes off camera, but also to be able to understand the story, because it really wasn't a story about numbers. Ultimately, it was a story about people, and they had really investigated these characters in a way that was very important. Now, this section of the film was very important to me because I think there was a kind of sea change that Enron very much wanted to take advantage of, and that was the sea change that came about when Ronald Reagan came into office. It was this idea that we would deregulate everything, that government was not the solution, it was the problem. And Enron was poised from the very start to take advantage of total deregulation in energy.
Biggest in size or the wealthiest in natural resources. No, what unites them all is their willingness to believe in the magic of the marketplace.
I love this shot. We got up very early in the morning to shoot this, and it really captures the extraordinary ability of HD to get all that detail. I could watch this tracking shot forever.
Through a merger of vast networks of natural gas pipelines,
This is a vast landscape of all these oil and natural gas refineries just outside of Houston. It really conveys some sense of the power we're dealing with here and the elements that ultimately undergird the power of our lights and so forth and so on. Now here's some footage that we found that put father, son, and Ken Lay together. Very unusual to find that piece of footage that has them all there.
Closer to the father, but while he was governor of Texas,
There's a lot of debate as to just how close W was to Ken Lay. There are a lot of letters that we could have included back and forth between Lay and W. It's very convenient now to say that he was only an acquaintance. And there's some evidence to suggest that they weren't that close, that he was closer to the father, which is what we say in the film. Rich Kinder, he's an interesting character who was passed over by Ken Lay, and that allows for the rise of Jeff Skilling. But these were videotaped messages from W and his dad indicating both their affection for Rich Kinder and how close they were to Enron, which I think is absolutely incontestable.
It matters, your family, your friends.
early on, George Bush Sr. helped secure billions in government subsidies for Enron.
We weren't able to go into the whole idea of Enron International in as much detail as we would have liked. But even though Enron was very much a company that was so pro-deregulation, it benefited a lot from both government subsidies and government help in terms of spearheading its attack or its assault on foreign markets. That's a story that, of course, is just, it's not peculiar to Enron. It's a peculiar kind of hypocrisy you often see, people talking about needing to get government out of the way of business, even as government is doing so much to undergird businesses' efforts with subsidies and help.
At a company called Enron Oil?
Yes, I was.
Now, we see the first mystery about Enron. This story, the Valhalla oil scandal, is a really very important story, I think, because it really shows in microcosm the larger story of Enron and that it happened so early. And so we felt it was very important to use this story early on. Now, something about the imagery here. We used a lot of these playful images, like that desk, the attaché case with the money. They were intended just to be playful. I mean, part of this story is terribly funny. We can't take it too seriously, and yet it's that kind of tragic-comic aspect I keep coming back to. And so we wanted to have some fun with it. And there are also iconic images, which is a way of saying to people, look, Enron is not an exception to the rule. It's the exaggeration of business as usual in many cases. Here's an interesting character, Lou Bourget. We reached hard to try and find a photograph of him. It wasn't easy. Mike Muckleroy was a great character. He was a guy who was there very much early on and knew a lot about what was going on then and really understood the basis of this scandal, but it was hard for him to get anybody to listen to him. There are some wonderful characters that we had to leave on the cutting room floor, most particularly Rebecca Mark, the woman who ran Enron International and who was Jeff Skilling's great rival. That was a very, very tough decision. But at the end of the day, we decided to leave her out because she didn't have that much to do with the fundamental fraud at Enron. She may have had something to do with how deeply in debt Enron was. A lot of her international companies did not do very well. But at the end of the day, I think she was a peripheral character for this kind of story. But she may have put a lot of pressure on other people at Enron to make more money than they otherwise would have to have done because her companies were not doing very well. But she's also a fascinating character and very smart and glamorous. And I wish we could have, if any viewers would have, stood still for a 3-hour film, I'm sure we would have included her, and it would have been fascinating to do so. That's just one example of a character that we had to leave on the cutting room floor. At the end of the day, as I was saying before, it's the story that forces you to figure out how the film is going to work. The story becomes the dictator, and you find out very quickly what is peripheral and what is not. There's a lot more detail to the Mike McElroy story, which is revealed in Peter and Bethany's book, which is really an extraordinary story. Because, they had gambled so heavily on oil futures that the whole company would have come down, would have come crashing to a halt if Mike McElroy hadn't gone up there and undid some of those trades. And he had to do so very secretively, because if the market had found out what kind of position Enron was holding, they would have crushed Enron. It would have all been over before it began.
The next day, Mastroeni came in with the real books. The traders had gambled away all of Enron's reserves. By acting fast, McElroy bluffed the market and managed to save the company.
I love these images of the calculator. It was all about the numbers in some way for Enron, because it was about making up the numbers. There's Lay very much in a preacher's pose.
He had seen the reports warning him about the traders' behavior.
Since the fall of Enron, this goes to the heart. This sets a certain idea in the audience's mind about what does Ken Lay know. Because later on, Ken Lay will say that he really didn't know about bad things going on in his company. Well, this story suggests that he may have known about many things. He may have not have known the details, but he set a kind of climate of accepting untoward behavior in the pursuit of money. So long as people were making money, almost anything would be acceptable. And that, I think, is the purpose of the Valhalla story.
Right in front of him.
Mastroeni received a suspended sentence.
It's interesting seeing Fitzgerald there. I mean, initially, the Enron investigation was very much of a bipartisan investigation, both Republicans or Democrats. In recent days, the Republicans have run away from their own rather positive role in that investigation.
Every day, every week.
I think the Enron story does transcend politics. This is not a story about Democrats or Republicans. This is a story about something fundamentally wrong with American culture. I think the message of the film, in a way, is a twist on that Enron phrase, ask why. The message of the film is actually a plea for people to ask why, to ask the simple questions, and to be willing to be critical and not to accept what the powerful and mighty tell you about the way things are. But at the same time, I think it's really about what's gone wrong in our society and how we may have made a fundamental turn in a wrong direction, that we've accepted this idea that by pursuing selfish goals, by pursuing pure self-interest, that the best possible social outcome will result. And I don't think that's true, and I think the California crisis in the Enron story proves that. By being as selfish as possible is not enough to do something to contribute to the larger social good.
An attorney from Vinson and Elkins, Amanda Martin, was one of the first...
Amanda Martin, the woman who's speaking here, is an extraordinary person. She was very high up at Enron and was very close to a lot of the people like Skilling, particularly Skilling, I think, not so much Lay, probably. But she had an extraordinary sense of perspective about the place, not only about Enron, but an extraordinary sense of perspective in general, because she's a good student of history. She's very well read. And like many of the women in the Enron story, they see both what was going on inside and felt that sense of ambition, but also could see it from the outside and had a larger sense of ethics and morality, I think. Interesting. Jeff Skilling, of course, wouldn't even take the position of president unless they got mark-to-market accounting.
I remember walking in and going, what's going on? And Causey and everybody. I mean, everyone was so excited, and then came the champagne.
She refers to a guy named Rick Causey who was going on trial with Skilling and Lay.
I often think about how clear my memory.
Look how young Amanda looks there. Look how young they all look. It's rather extraordinary. They look so full of hope and a sense of idealism, which I think they all had at the beginning. I love this music, that horn playing, and the overlapping images of the calculator. That was an idea that Alison Elwood, the genius editor and co-producer of the film, had, where it's a sense of one image laid on top of another, shifting reality, I think is a better way to put it, because I think early on they felt they were doing something special, something new, something very important, something very powerful, and over time it got away from them. And the images of the calculator keys really comment on that.
Great, Jeff. Good to see. Todd, sit down.
We've been working hard on this.
Now, this skit is extraordinary.
Origination.
It is amazing that Enron performed so many of these skits. We were only able to put in one. The Department of Justice has many, many more of them. We have some of the scripts of these skits, and some of them are just as staggering as this one. There's one with a Wizard of Oz theme, in which Sharon Watkins plays the Wicked Witch of the West, and she sprinkles pixie dust on everybody and says they're going to do deals with smoke and mirrors. And Andy Fastow is the Wizard of Oz. He pops out of a black box. It's really staggering. And the Harvard Business Review remarked that they felt these skits were a kind of moral escape valve, a way that the people at Enron had of kind of venting their own sense of discomfort over some of the territory that they found themselves in. And the skits, while they were meant to be humorous and were jokes, nevertheless acted or played that role.
One of his favorite books.
I love that image of Jeff Skilling. Now, I should say that the selfish gene, I mean, I think Jeff Skilling misunderstood the selfish gene. It's really not all about how you should be selfish. It simply takes a sort of neo-Darwinian perspective and has a lot to say, actually, that book, about how it's important that for your own survival to cooperate. But nevertheless, I think Jeff Skilling saw in it something else. There's another one of those iconic images.
Really trickled down and affected everything about how Enron did business.
He instituted this program called the PRC. This is very interesting. This whole idea of this brutal competition inside the company. It was supposed to steel Enron's employees like good warriors so that they could really rape and pillage outside the company. And, you know, Enron wasn't the only company that did something like this. GE, the company that Skilling admired, also did something in this vein. But Enron took it to another level, took it to another dimension, the Enron dimension, so unique in so many ways, but so much predicated on what other companies were doing. And the big problem with this was that, you know, the process that seemed very competitive, it almost as if it was a meritocracy, soon assumed a kind of political dimension where friends would buck up their own friends in the committees, and they'd punish their enemies, not for any good professional reasons, but simply because they didn't like them. That was really the problem.
Our culture is a tough culture. It is a very, very aggressive culture.
Now here you see the Enron trading floor, which was at its height. This is the real Enron thing when it was really going full bore. Some of this footage, I believe, we obtained from Frontline. You know, I think the traders in Skilling's mind were emblematic of how it should all work, because after all, traders really are dog-eat-dog characters who, you know, perform on a regular basis as predators, and they succeed or don't succeed on their ability to best other people. But that approach, the approach of the trader, didn't always work so well with, say, customers who, depending on you for a predictable delivery of electricity or natural gas. So the trader mentality, which ultimately took over Enron, was not necessarily the best kind of mentality for all aspects of Enron's business. Now, this commercial, one of Enron's many loony commercials from the Enron dimension, was all about the magic of the marketplace. this new economic religion. And the idea was that Enron, unlike the blind mice of regulated industries, was going to create something absolutely new, something wild, something special. And there's that great slogan, "Ask why." If only more people had asked why. Now, I love this photograph. Bethany really understands Jeff Skilling. Here's the I Am Enron photograph. Look how it's shot from down below, the big buildings in the background. That sense that I am the company. And I think at some point he felt he was the company. This physical transformation is just fantastic. This is what makes Skilling a kind of Gatsby-like character. He literally transforms himself. You see him with a grizzled beard there, the sunglasses, the boots, going on these motorbike rides. It was really an amazing thing to see them transform themselves from one kind of person physically into another kind of person. In some ways, I admired that very much about Enron. In other ways, I think it's part of that Enron dimension, that kind of looniness you saw at the company, that sense of imagination run amok, where suddenly you were into a kind of fantasy land. And there's an image that speaks to that fantasy, I think. Here's the Jeff Skilling theme song, Marilyn Manson's version of Sweet Dreams.
Wanting to go on trips that were so perilous that someone could actually die.
Everybody had their own, the three big execs had their theme songs. This was Skilling's. Now, music was very important in this film, obviously, and I also wanted music to have that playful role. And sometimes it acted as a kind of toe-tapping Greek chorus. It was my way of interjecting myself in the film without actually photographing myself, which, by the way, we tried and promptly rejected.
Think about what strange insecurities they were trying to overcome.
Yeah, these photographs are the characters. These other images are images that we shot of motorcycles, and we cut them together in a way that I think is powerful.
This is a trip where people crash.
One of the things we did with these images is intercutting them with the actual images of the Enron executives from the motorbike rides, is then we would take these images and take them further and further, so that like Enron and the Enron execs going into the Enron dimension, these images would show that they take this idea and take it, one step beyond.
Jeff Skilling had a way of describing people that he liked. He said, "I like guys with spikes."
Yes, guys with spikes. Again, it gets to that idea of combat. It's almost like the time of knights in shining armor, where they'd have these jousts, and that would indicate how far up the pecking order you were. How many jousts would you win? If you won a lot of jousts, inside the company, then you'd go out and with your lance and show the colors of Enron out in the world. And Lupai is certainly an interesting character, and as I spoke about Enron after the film came out, more men particularly came up to me and asked questions about Lupai, almost in a way that was all too curious, as if they wanted to know, how could I become more like Lupai, the guy who, walked off with $350 million and his stripper girlfriend, and who was so addicted to strip clubs that he spent all his time there among the flesh and the money. There's something about the strippers. I thought a long time about whether to include this whole striptease aspect, and yet that, to me, gets back to the whole evolutionary biology thing. And at this point, probably people are thinking I'm going off the rails. But the whole notion of evolutionary biology is that men have a different strategy than women do when it comes to reproduction, because for men it makes more sense for your genes to have as many women in effect as possible. And for that, the strip club is the ultimate metaphor, where you have one after another after another. And that's another reason why I set this scene to the music of Philip Glass's music from Einstein on the Beach, where you just hear those numbers over and over again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's as if it was all about more at Enron. The numbers at some point were everything, either the numbers they imagined or the real numbers. But it was this notion that it wasn't really a company as much as it was a numbers manufacturing machine. If you could manufacture those earnings at the end of every quarter, then riches, untold riches were yours.
One night he was at a club, and one of the guys said, you know, Lou.
Now, this story is a wonderful story, and Peter had collected a number of them. Peter and Bethany were such great reporters. They really understood this. Houston, apparently, was where they invented the silicone breast implant, so that was another nice collision of different trends. And these gentlemen's clubs were much attended by the Enron folks, but they were very much of a Houston tradition. I love this photograph, Lou Pye, the Iceman. Who would have thought to take such a photograph? Ask why.
The guy who told the joke, as Enron legend has it.
Again, this is playful imagery that we found, and we couldn't believe when we found this shot of this guy walking through the snow with a gas can, standing in for the Enron executive who was dispatched to Calgary.
I netted approximately $100 million. But I don't know if that number's accurate, plus or minus 20 million.
I love that. Plus or minus 20 million. How many of us could say that? Plus or minus 20 million. I'm not sure if that's right. It's close, maybe 20 million here or there. At Enron, of course, 20 million was a small number.
His exit from Enron was as mysterious as his presence there. Just sort of one day.
Jake Eberts really had a certain insight into Lou Pye. He worked under him at EES.
Though Lou Pye flew away from Enron with $250 million.
Yeah, Lou Pye's ranch in Colorado was actually larger than Rhode Island. I always found that staggering. The sense of excess there was just extraordinary. And I'm glad that we got in a few images of planes. We weren't able to capture any of the Enron jets in action, but a lot of other companies referred to them as the Enron Air Force. They had so many private jets.
On Wall Street, and you were going to do whatever you had to do to stay there. And Jeff understood those rules better than I think anyone else.
Now, this song is so perfect. There's something about this song that just struck me as the absolute perfect song for the internet bubble. Love me, say that you love me, fool me, go on and fool me. It's just this insouciance that was irrepressible.
Even the person with very little disposable income all of a sudden began to play in the stock market because nobody could fail, because stock prices were just going up and up and up.
And this is where we all participate in the Enron story. We were all looking at the stock market. It wasn't unique to Enron. Everybody thought it could never go down. And I think the Enron people felt that maybe that would be so. Now, you can see these graphics below. You know, we tried very hard. The wonderful Ben Fine, who's an extraordinary graphic artist, came up with this rationale of putting certain tickers down below, which echoed what was going on in the film. And communicating information via ticker seemed very sensible. There's Maria Bartiromo. She was a key cheerleader during this period. I'm not saying she was, a tool of Enron in any way. She was very much on her own. But we got a lot of these tapes from people who had done a study of Maria Bartiromo and whether or not her picks, had an influence on whether stocks would go up. You can see the way we shot these interviews with Bethany and others with a lot of reflections in the foreground. That was very important to us, too, because it was, again, that sense of two sides to Enron. And subconsciously, I think you get that notion when you see the reflections off the table. I love these tickers. We spent a lot of time shooting tickers. There was something so magical about them. These dots that would move seemingly as if defying gravity. I love them here surrounding Amanda for that reason. And Allison Elwood, the editor, did a wonderful job of superimposing them on all sorts of images, which did double duty in some ways because a lot of the tapes we had from Enron and other places were so degraded. It was a nice sheen that we put on the imagery to, again, convey both sides as always, but also to give this sense that the numbers were dominating everything, that sense that you would just wake up every morning and look at the stock prices. Now, here's a pullback I love, because we had this Enron video that then we pulled back from to show it inside a TV set, which spoke a lot to the way Enron would create these promotions, but also with that reflection in the foreground. It very much mirrored what we were trying to do with the look of the interviews. Now, this footage is so delicious to me. Alan Greenspan receiving the Enron Prize. Alan looks a little uncomfortable there, I must say. Yet nevertheless, he did show up. Perhaps it was Baker who forced him there.
They continued to sell the company as being a very stable place where it could predictably increase profits.
You can see the way these images just bathe over the photographs. One thing that goes relatively uncommented on in the film is the role of the press, but we included a lot of images of magazine articles. Here again is this extreme motorcycle footage really pushed to the limit as we licensed this from somebody else, this Grand Canyon thing, which is unbelievable.
Enron had vast natural gas...
But going back to this idea of the press, we included a lot of magazine articles because the magazine writers and the TV journalists at the time were really very much a part of creating the Enron mystique, and Enron very much used them. And in their own way, the press early on was very much part of the fraud, unintentionally perhaps, but they were cheerleaders for what Enron was doing. This is all about the Dabhol plant in India. I wish we had more time to spend on this. Enron was such a vast operation, and I would have liked to have gone into Enron International more. This was just one example of an utterly failed project that cost Enron a fantastic amount of money and put it in a deeper and deeper hole. The fact was that Enron was just not a very good company and kept losing money. And yet they convinced everybody that they were a great company. That was the con. Jeff Skilling always believed that the only reason that Enron went down was because it lost so much money in its international operations. I suppose there's some truth to that. They certainly did lose money in their international operations, but I'm not sure that we would remember Enron as the kind of company it is known as today because of its money losing in its international operations. We remember Enron because it made it up.
To ultimately become the largest
there Ken Lay is drowning in a sea of dots.
The wholesale and retail level nationwide.
What brought all this on was with deregulation. They said that we would not survive unless we joined forces.
Now, we didn't spend much time with the victims of the Enron collapse, but here's one character who to me is a true victim. He's a very stoic man. Who was a very hard worker for a public utility for many years, and then had all of his PGE stock converted to Enron stock. And I think he, like everybody else, was sold this bill of goods that Enron was a very stable place when in fact it wasn't. At the end of the day, I would hope that nobody would think that this film is about a few bad apples at Enron. In a way, this film is about all of us. At some point in time, all of us will be seduced by the money and wonder whether or not we're doing the right thing to get it. By which I mean to say, I don't think capitalism is bad. I don't think that at all. But I think cutthroat capitalism, in which nothing else matters but the pursuit of the almighty dollar, there's something fundamentally wrong with that. There is no such thing as a pure, invisible hand. This is really a staggering story. The banks, Enron's banks, and the investment banks, and the brokerage firms, it's amazing how complicit they were in the Enron story. Jeff Skilling saying he was absolutely upfront with the analysts. Nothing could be more false. And yet at the same time, the analysts were so invested in the fiction that Jeff Skilling was creating that it hardly made any difference whether he was upfront with them or not. They weren't really doing any analyzing. I think, part of it, of course, was the notion that these brokerage firms were also doing a lot of securities business with companies like Enron, and so it was in their interest to say that Enron was a great stock because then they get more business on the other side of the ledger. But I think the bigger thing was this kind of strange circular relationship that so many people on Wall Street had when it came to Enron.
John Olson, one of the only analysts skeptical of the Enron story.
Enron loved analysts' strong buy recommendations.
Now, John Olson was not immune to the Enron mystique, but he was mostly immune. And he was a very interesting character in the sense that, you know, he really put all of his analytical tools to work at examining what Enron was as a company and tried to issue a very honest critique of Enron. And in that environment, nobody wanted to hear bad news, particularly Enron. And so they basically had Olson fired for this, which is kind of staggering.
Getting large bonuses from the investment banking departments to bring in investment banking deals. Once that happened.
Now, Chanos, I should say, is a short seller. That's something that we weren't able to point out in the film, and we didn't point it out because it's too complicated, and I'm not sure I can understand it or even explain it now, except that a short seller is somebody who profits from a stock going down rather than up. But I think the more important thing about Chanos is not that he had an interest in Enron stock going down. Yes, of course he did, but the more important thing about Chanos is he was a very vigorous analyst of exactly what was going on at Enron. And if it took a short seller to analyze that, well then, so be it. Now this is another extraordinary Enron commercial.
Themes around here is to always be asking why something's done a certain way or why it's not done.
They hired this guy, Tony Kaye, to do these Enron commercials. And he created a vision of the world almost in which it was all linked by these magnificent screens and this magnificent vision of Enron. Ask why, question conventional wisdom. This ask why thing always floored me because to me it was like the criminal in those movies where you have a serial killer or something, always leaving clues for the detective. I think that was that great unconscious clue for all of us. Enron was saying, ask why, go ahead, ask why, we dare you.
One analyst summed up his recommendation to investors in one word.
This conveys some sense of the frenzy. You know, they had these meetings where Scott McNeely from Sun Microsystems came in for one of their big meetings, and everybody was convinced that Enron was just going to take over the world. Now, here Jeff Skilling is talking about video on demand. I mean, we're still talking about video on demand. And the problem was that at the time, Enron was representing it as a technology that was now. It's still not here. It wasn't a bad idea, but Enron was so desperate to make it happen right away.
That didn't make a penny.
By the end of the year 2000, Enron was running out of ways to make the broadband business look successful. They'd tried every trick in the bag to try to create the illusion of a business where there was none, and the people who were working there were getting increasingly desperate.
The executives
again, you see the constant play of these numbers on these people. I mean, that you could make so much money so quickly just by goosing the stock. It must have been so very hard to resist. And I think at some point, all of the executives imagined that the company really was as good as they were saying it was.
In fact, the fraud is the reality.
You couldn't help but want to imagine that, and at a certain point, you couldn't help but believe it, I imagine.
You spoke about bandwidth trading. What about weather options or futures?
Yes, trading weather, trading air, trading space in containers. Enron, the idea was that the company could trade anything. The idea was that anything could be a pipeline, and Enron could figure out a way to make money on anything that would move, anything that was at all even tangible or imaginable.
Jeff, as time went on, had a...
Now, again, these images of the mad scientist and so forth, it's wacky, it's playful, but it was fun. And this image, I think, is an extension of those earlier images, the extreme motocross. It conveys to the audience, people who don't know that much about finance, an emotional sense of what it must be like falling, what was going to come for Enron.
The captain of the ship was?
Kenneth Lay.
It was very intuitive. Here's another metaphor that came up over and over again for Enron. The emperor has no clothes.
Wall Street history. Shares plummeted 31%.
Tech stocks led Friday's fierce sell-off.
Enron looked so beautiful, and yet it was all an illusion, much like the illusion created for the emperor.
By the end of the year 2000, because by then most internet companies had already begun to fall and everybody on Wall Street was looking for the next big thing. And here you had Enron, which appeared to be this shining star of a new economy company. Its stock price went up 90% in the year 2000 and had gone up over 50% the year before that. It was an it stock on Wall Street.
Yes, here you can see once again the role of the press, this magnificent image on the cover of Business Week. This sense that, the people at Enron had become these superstars. I love this image, too, because they're so empty. So there's no heart for either Ken Lay or Jeff Skilling. That's empty inside of those electrical towers. But they're very powerful, and they convey a lot of electricity. Now, this is amazing. Fortune magazine, the company that employed Peter and Bethany, clearly was completely on the wrong side of Enron. They cited them as the most innovative company a number of years running. In their defense, later on, Fortune joked that they were right. Enron was innovative. We just didn't know for what reason.
Who knows where the earnings come from? They just pop out, and all we know is they're always good.
Now, Chanos's team is really interesting in this world of very complex corporate finance. He has a research team that's quite extraordinary in terms of understanding exactly what makes a company tick and how or why it may be overvalued. They're like corporate detectives. And indeed, so are Peter and Bethany. They were corporate detectives, too.
In March 2001, Bethany McLean...
Now, I love this part of the story. Bethany becomes very much part of the Enron story. And let's listen to what Skilling has to say here, because he's so arrogant about who Bethany is.
You got very upset, didn't you?
I very specifically remember the telephone conversation that I had with the Fortune reporter.
The Fortune reporter.
Called up and started asking some very, very specific questions about accounting treatment on things. I am not an accountant.
Yeah, he's the guy who asked for mark-to-market accounting.
Really, really agitated. He said that people who raised questions like this were just trying to throw rocks at the company, and that I
think Bethany didn't have any idea at this moment just why he was getting so agitated.
And how off-base my questions were.
Mr. Skilling, it appears as if you were trying to bully someone.
He clearly was. That was his great ability, was an intellectual bully. He could be an intellectual bully better than anybody.
I've got 6 minutes left before I have to be in a meeting, and I can't.
Now, this is a very interesting thing that he says.
And she said, well, that's fine. We're going to do the article anyway. And I said, if you do that, I personally think that's unethical. And the next day, our chief financial officer and our chief accounting officer flew to New York at Enron's expense to sit down, not with the editors, but to sit down with the reporter on that story and help her understand the questions that she was asking.
And listen to that. And help her understand the questions she was asking. How arrogant is that? She didn't even really understand the questions she was asking. And that was key to what Enron did. That's why Peter and Bethany, I think, called their book The Smartest Guys in the Room. They strutted around and pretended that they were the smartest guys in the room. And they bluffed everybody into thinking that they were, because everyone was too insecure to, in the words of Enron, ask why.
By Andy Fastow that were doing business with Enron. And these were disclosed in the company's financial statements, but I didn't mention them.
It really took extraordinary courage, I think, for Bethany to write this very first piece. Which, as she said, was a relatively mild piece. Is Enron overpriced? That's not a kind of fraud piece. But nevertheless, at that time, to take on Enron really took a lot of guts. And it gives you some sense of how hard it is to move against the herd. Everybody believed that the internet boom was going to go on forever, and everyone believed that Enron was such a great company, and it's very hard to rudder against that.
Difficult for us to show people
And this is a wonderful moment. Jeff Skilling explaining to his troops why the fortune piece is completely disingenuous, which is very much what the Bush administration is doing now in terms of trying to discredit the press. They're saying, you know, they're not writing this about the facts. They're just doing this to compete with Business Week. It's really an astounding notion here. And of course, he's covering his ass at this moment because Jeff Skilling knew that there were things wrong with Enron. But I think the cover for that was always to pretend that there was nothing wrong, ever, which is ultimately what got Enron into so much trouble. Look, here's that wonderful image, the man with no heart.
You have to be willing to say that the emperor doesn't have any clothes, and this emperor was pretty powerful.
We are going to unveil this morning a new corporate vision.
These employee meetings, which we sprinkle throughout the film, are fascinating. Look at this, presenting to your company this new slogan that they are the world's leading company. That is the Enron dimension.
There was a protege of Jeff Skilling's by the name of Andy Fastow.
Traffic's Dear Mr. Fantasy. That's the theme song for Andy Fastow. There's something, again, picking the music, it was very hard. It had to fit a couple of different criteria. It had to feel right, in addition to being spot on in terms of the comment. And it had to have a certain sensibility. We tried a lot of different pieces there. Ultimately, this is the one that fit the best.
At Enron was Andy Fastow.
You know, there's a lot of debate among some people as to whether or not Andy Fastow was solely responsible for Enron's downfall. That is very much Ken Lay's approach now, and I suspect Jeff Skilling's approach as they near the trial. But I think it was Peter and Bethany's view, and certainly mine by the end, that Andy Fastow was a guy who, while morally weak, to say the least, nevertheless acted to prop up Enron for a couple of years in order to allow it to survive where it wouldn't have survived on its own. That was the magic trick.
Perform a magic trick.
I mean, he had to hide all of Enron's debt. And again, you know, people need to understand that these off-the-books entities that Andy Fastow created, in and of themselves, were not illegal or unethical or wrong, but the extent to which he did them and the extreme way he went about it and the way he feathered his own nest in doing it, that was pure Enron. That was the Enron dimension.
They could bury losses.
Because, you know, Jedi, you look at these names, I mean, it was all about fiction. Raptors, Jedi. It was some kind of strange Star Wars fantasy that all of these guys were living out.
For himself.
Now, this piece of footage is just extraordinary. This is where Andy Fastow is actually selling his idea to a bunch of Merrill Lynch bankers. And I also love what we ultimately came up here. This is kind of the Sorcerer's Apprentice shot where we put one image on top of another and allowed this to get very degraded as you see Skilling's eyes. Because Andy Fastow was definitely very much Jeff Skilling's guy, his boy, as Sharon Watkins says. Sharon, I think, understands Andy very well, understands how weak he was and how much he was able to be manipulated by Skilling. He so badly wanted to please Skilling. Now, here's the denial by Skilling, where he says, oh, yes, everybody looked at these transactions and they all felt it was appropriate. You know, at the end of the day, that is something that Enron really must symbolize in a larger sense, which is that you can often buy the kind of high-priced opinions from accounting firms and law firms that you want to get. And Enron really did that better than anybody. But I think it's caused a lot of people in the legal area and certainly in the accounting firm area to question whether or not they should be performing some sort of higher role, that they can't just be shills for a particular company, that they need to represent a kind of a standard. Here's that extraordinary tape again. here's where he's saying, look, man, I know where all the assets of Enron are because I'm the chief financial officer, and I'm going to wheel and deal these assets to your benefit and to my benefit. And it's going to benefit Enron because, gee, it's going to whistle around assets to make us look good at the end of every quarter. I mean, these guys their jaws must have been dropping as they realized that, they were shooting fish in a barrel. No, he wouldn't be on both sides of the transaction, absolutely not. Always on the LJM side, that is to say, his side. He was going to betray Enron for the benefit of LJM and his other partners. Everybody was going to be making money, and yet Enron was making out too because it made it look like Enron was doing better than it was. It's really staggering. Now, Ken Lay and Jeff Skilling say, oh, well, how are we to know what Andy Fastow was doing? But both of them signed off on his conflict of interest. I love this grainy video. It doesn't matter. It almost looks dirtier that it's so grainy. It looks like a surveillance video.
5 or 6 of the name brand banks who have stepped up and said they'll commit to this.
Commit they did, and why not?
I love Peter Coyote's voice. Peter has worked with me on other projects. He's got such an extraordinary bedrock Americana voice, but he's such a smart guy. And he himself is a writer that, particularly for films that have relatively complicated material, he always makes you believe that he understands it for the very good reason that he does understand it. And yet he never oversells it. He talks to you as if he's relaying a story to you across the table at a restaurant.
Citibank, Merrill Lynch, Deutsche Bank.
This is, to me, the most staggering part of the Enron story. I mean, all these banks are bedrock. We think of as bedrock, the fundamental banks of our nation. And yet they were all involved in the Enron story. Enron is definitely not a story of a few bad apples. It's a story of a broader culture of corruption. I love the idea that this analyst quotes Vladimir Lenin. Useful idiots. You see very few energy analysts who quote Lenin. Even John Lennon, never mind Vlad.
But at times,
Carl Levin is another hero for me in this story. Carl Levin is one of the few people, I think, in the House and the Senate who truly understood some of the transactions that were taking place at Enron. And he had a very strong moral standing, too. So he was able to look the bankers in particular in the eye and say, you got to be kidding me. Now, this was at the end of the day, it's all about the money. All these people were being paid so much that they did virtually anything to keep getting paid that much money. Here, I think Amanda is right on the money. Now, Amanda was also being paid very well, I should point out. But she understood the kind of corruption that was taking place.
Hard now to say, oh, we didn't know anything.
Had we known then what we know now about Enron's practices?
Yes, reading from a very tightly controlled script.
What we now have come to light about Enron, however, were not known at the time.
No. Nobody knew anything.
Transactions acted in good faith.
I'd like you here to look at one city email.
Yes, Carl Levin. Yes, he knows very well.
Here is all too lurid.
I wish I could have shown more emails. I don't know if many viewers would have been with me by the end of the film if I had. But the emails were extraordinary because they were so honest. I think there's a deep-seated need to be very open, that people have a hard time hiding anything. And so they write emails that are very wide out in the open. They do skits. People are really very much without guile, I think, even though they try so very hard to hide things. I love this example, the Nigerian barge scandal. What were Merrill Lynch bankers doing with Nigerian barges, Nigerian power barges? Shuffling money.
Merrill Lynch's business. It was a blatantly illegal transaction. It was just taking the barges, getting them off Enron's books, having Merrill Lynch...
Now, the Merrill Lynch executives, many of them involved in this transaction, were convicted. over a transaction that didn't mean much, really, in terms of dollars. But, now I love this moment.
Was going to confirm
that sense of disgust as he drops the piece of paper. Again, Jeff Skilling shot from a very, very low angle. The glistening skyscrapers in the background. The contemptuous gaze. Bethany understood Jeff Skilling very well, I think. This idea of the two sides of Jeff Skilling, always two sides, just like the reflection on the table reflecting Bethany here. You know, that on the one hand, he was contemptuous of everybody because he knew just how great Enron was, and yet he was smart enough to know that Enron was hollow, and he had to balance those two ideas simultaneously.
Aggressively wondering out loud.
Here's the famous phone conversation in which Jeff Skilling called an analyst an asshole. I had to look long and hard for this because Enron had erased the asshole part almost right after the conference call happened. But after digging very hard, we finally found a tape that had preserved the asshole, and were able to include it in the film. That really gets at the sense of arrogance and contempt that Skilling had for so many people.
And this just caused unbelievable amounts of consternation all across Wall Street because people thought a Fortune 500 CEO...
That's what's hard for people to understand. I mean, these things are very well orchestrated. They go according to a script. They're almost like corporate fictions, these presentations to analysts. And for somebody to lose it like that is really staggering.
Took a piece of paper and tucked it under the pile of papers on his desk. And afterwards, Enron's traders, who had erupted in cheers when Skilling called this guy an asshole, made him a sign. There was a play off Enron's motto, "Ask Why," and the sign said, "Ask why, asshole."
Ask why. There's the ask why coming back again.
That Jeff looked at the numbers. And he knew.
Now, this is important. I mean, Amanda really does have a perspective on Skilling, and I think, you know, I was very interested, like Bethany, and Peter too, but Bethany in particular, very interested in Skilling. I tried very hard to get an interview with him. I was told that there was one point where he was considering it, but then there was an incident in New York in which caused the judge to revoke his bail and impose harsh new conditions on him. That may have interrupted that. But I really regret that I was not able to talk to either Skilling or Lay, and I tried very hard to talk to both, even to Fastow. I wonder if the documentary would have been different. I'm not sure how it would have been different. But at the end of the day, I think that both Skilling and Lay are well represented in terms of the image that you see of them that they chose to present in those public forums.
One of the things that was always a strange occurrence at Enron was...
Here's somebody who really felt that end of the quarter thing personally. More people talk to us about that. Tremendous pressure coming down at the end of every quarter to make the numbers.
Miraculously, we always made the numbers and then some.
This was a guy I would have liked to have spent more time with, Tom White, who later became Secretary of the Army. There were a lot of tangents we would have liked to have pursued. Enron was a huge story. The biggest part of the Enron story for me really was the California story. And here's something where the film could do something substantial, I think, that the book couldn't do, in part because we discovered these extraordinary audio tapes of the Enron traders. That was not something that Peter and Bethany had access to when they were writing their book. I should say a little something about this in advance of hearing these audio tapes. These audio tapes of the Enron traders taking down the California grid were discovered by the Snohomish Public Utility District, a small utility in Washington state. And the reason they discovered them was that Enron, post-bankruptcy Enron, was suing Snohomish for non-payment of their electrical bill. And Snohomish said, "You got to be kidding me. You know, you're suing us for non-payment? You were gouging us." Enron said, "No, we're suing you." So in a bit of corporate and legal jujitsu, they fought back by getting a subpoena to get all of these trader tapes. Now, in a trading situation, they often run audio tapes constantly so that you can confirm a trade after the fact. And so Snohomish got their hands on these tapes and then went through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours and discovered all sorts of wild things going on that people imagined were going on, but Snohomish people actually heard them taking place. And they were staggered by it, and they began to release some of them. And then we poured through them and ultimately put some of them together in greater length than some of the news media did to show how some of the transactions worked. But the amazing thing about this California story is that if you would have thought about it in advance, you would have shook this off as a kind of nutty conspiracy theory, the idea that Enron and a bunch of other companies were going to get together to game the California electricity markets for fun and for profit, and in so doing would cause massive blackouts that would plunge the state into darkness. You'd say that's a joke, that's some sort of conspiracy theory. But the staggering thing about the audio tapes is that, in fact, the conspiracy theory was true.
Market ought to work, not a one.
Joe Dunn there is reflecting very honestly about the fact that regulators and politicians were really unprepared for the complexity of electricity markets. They didn't really understand what they were getting into. And I think there was very little sympathy at Enron for those people. They thought, who are they? Just some hokey, know-nothing politicians, and if they're not going to listen to us, then we'll show them just how markets work. There was a sense that they were thinning the herd. They were doing what Darwin suggested you do. If you have people who, shouldn't be around, then so be it.
Guys at Enron was Tim Belden, who ran the West Coast trade.
This guy, Tim Belden, is an interesting character. It was very hard to find an image of Tim Belden. We finally found a photograph from a high school yearbook. But Tim Belden was a real free market ideologue. He ultimately believed that it was the job, in effect, of the Enron traders to practice tough love on the California market. And by gaming the California market, Enron and all the other companies that participated, El Paso, Dynegy, Reliant, et cetera, they would reform the market by showing how screwed up it was. It was a deeply cynical idea, and yet it was very much part of free market ideology. It was not their job to do the job of the regulators. It was their job to attack the ridiculous regulations and in so doing make a lot of money for themselves in the process. And hopefully the regulators would see the errors of their ways and reform the markets in a more freewheeling direction.
Rephrase that. Okay. He arbitrages the California market to the tune of $1 million or two a day. Right.
You can see that language. He's joking about, changing the word stealing to arbitraging. It was some kind of cosmic joke to them because the only market that was a good market as far as the traders were concerned was an utterly free market with no regulations whatsoever.
And a creative trader is a trader that can find arbitrage opportunities.
Arbitrage opportunities.
Ricochet.
I'll see you guys. I'm taking mine to the desert.
Taking mine to the desert meant sending electricity out to the desert, waiting for the prices to rise and then bringing it back in state. I should also say that many of these games were not necessarily illegal. Some of them were perfectly legal, but they were highly unethical in the sense that they were contributing to blackouts that would ultimately plunge the state into darkness.
Ways to move power around.
Now, Colin Whitehead, this trader from Enron who's talking here, I give Colin an extraordinary amount of credit. Colin believes much more than I do in the virtues of the free market, particularly when it comes to electricity. But Colin, I think, saw a lot of things at Enron that he really did not agree with. And, at some personal risk to himself, he came forward and talked about his experiences in a way that I think gives a sense for all of us that these weren't bad people, these traders, these Enron traders. They were people who were operating within a culture that was predatory, purposefully predatory, and at this stage in Enron's existence, desperate to make profits. Because that's one thing that some people haven't understood about the film. They wonder, well, if they made a lot of money in California, why didn't they survive? I thought Enron was going down. The fact was, Enron was going down very fast, and they desperately needed huge profits from California in order to stay afloat. Now, this back and forth between Skilling and Barbara Boxer is very interesting. I mean, it testifies to the kind of contempt that he had for politicians and regulators. And Barbara Boxer herself is grandstanding, but in this instance is sticking up for the people of California.
David up at Enron? Uh-huh. There's not much demand for power.
Now, this is a staggering moment.
Could you bring it back up in 3 or 4 hours? Oh, yeah.
Here, they're calling the Enron trader is calling a power plant and asking it to shut down so that prices can go up. Now, I should point out that the power plants weren't owned by Enron. So there was an incredible amount of collusion going on in the market. People learned to play these games because the California market, I would say, was rather badly designed in the sense that they weren't able to defend themselves very well. And electricity is something that flows in real time. You can't store it. So you have to make decisions very quickly.
On its leash whenever they wanted to, and they did it, and they did it, and they did it, and they made so much money.
The heart of it is that an industry that went for 100 years, from the days of Edison, built the best electrical system in the world, sold the power at reasonable prices to consumers, and was very reliable, was all of a sudden turned into a casino.
Now, I love this piece of music by Oingo Boingo, a band that Danny Elfman, who composes so much of the music by Tim Burton and many others, was in some time ago. The bass line, the power of the drums, and the utterly unapologetic phrasing. There's nothing wrong with the capitalism. The idea here was to put yourself in the seat of the traders rather than to use some sort of sad music that would represent the point of view of the victims. The idea is to say, okay, imagine you're in the seat of the traders, you're having fun, and you're taking down the California grid because you've got that much power, and you're doing it for an enormous amount of money because you can.
And we're the future of Enron, and we're fucking making $500 million for Enron. Can you believe that?
Because I think that, the trader culture, we shouldn't be shocked by a lot of the swearing and predatory behavior that goes on a trading floor. That's the way it happens all the time. But the fact of the matter was that at Enron, the traders had taken over. The inmates had taken over the asylums, other people say. In other companies, traders were more severely internally regulated.
The Enron traders never seem to step back and say, wait, is what we're doing ethical? Is it in our best long-term interests? Does it help us if we totally...
So as a result of this, we had a lot of discussion in the cutting room about these traders, and had we created the impression that these are just a bunch of bad guys, and if only those particular bad guys weren't there, everything would have been okay. And that brought us to the point of trying to create some sense that these were not extraordinary people, extraordinarily bad people. They were everyday people, and many of them off the job were extraordinarily decent people. But on the job, they were killers. And how did that happen? Well, in some ways, I think the only conclusion you can come to is that the culture at Enron infected them in a way that they lost any sense of moral perspective. It doesn't mean that these traders should be forgiven for what they did. I don't think they should. But it gives some sense of larger understanding that it was not a few bad apples.
Their multi-million-dollar bonuses? Or had Enron found a way to exploit the darker side of human...
I learned two powerful things from the Enron scandal. One was that corruption has very little to do with good people or bad people. It has to do with a kind of environment and the willingness of people to forget about certain fundamental precepts that they may believe in off the job. I think anybody was capable of doing what was done at Enron, that faced with that much money and that much power, there were a lot of people who might have done what Lay and Skilling did. There are other people who might have gone along it's very hard to separate ourselves from that. And I think as angry as we may be at the end of the Enron story, and a lot of people tell me that they are very angry, and I don't blame them, because the Enron story made me very angry too. I think we can't lose sight of the fact that it does no good for us to distance ourselves from Skilling and Lay and Fastow. The way to go forward is to admit that there are aspects of those characters in all of us. That's why I asked the question at the beginning of the film, is this the dark shadow of the American dream? There's something very powerful and important about the American dream, pulling yourselves up by your bootstraps, but also something dark about the idea of the American dream if all you care about is the money. The other thing that I think is powerful that I learned from the Enron scandal is how important it is to ask why. One of the great things about the Enron story is that it was a grand fiction. It was a grand illusion. That was another title that was bandied about for a while. That was perpetrated on the American public, but it wasn't, in a way, perpetrated is a bad word, that the American public wanted so badly to believe in. It was a wonderful myth because it seemed so appealing. Great, a company that doesn't have to really produce anything, just the brains of a few very smart people in Houston that can manufacture earnings out of, lightning bolts. It was a very appealing story that everybody wanted to believe in, and so they did. There was a suspension of disbelief that was staggering. Enron, in many ways, was like a Hollywood film studio because they manufactured illusions, and those illusions were very seductive. So what I learned from Enron was that it's very important to ask why, as Colin suggests at the end of the film. And even if you don't understand something, you can ask why in a very simple way and demand very basic answers, and that should be utterly acceptable.
Tonight I'm declaring a state of emergency.
Now, some people have commented on Gray Davis and wondering whether or not the film is too easy on him. Now, here's one critic of Gray Davis that we included at great length, who felt that Gray Davis capitulated to the power companies and ended up taking a lot of money out of the state treasury to pay for electricity. Gray Davis feels strongly that he did what he needed to do to keep the lights on. But I think in a broad sense, the film does see Gray Davis in a sympathetic light because it's easy for us now to second-guess him, to Monday morning quarterback him. But the fact was, at the time, Gray Davis didn't have access to those corporate audio tapes that showed exactly what Enron was doing. At the time, Enron was using all of its power, all of its corporate, political, and lobbying power to ridicule the governor and to ridicule any attempts to portray it in a negative light. How could you possibly believe that Enron would be doing anything wrong? And that PR was very successful. And again, it goes back to the question of ask why. Here's another joke. Again, the Titanic comes up.
And this is being webcast. I know I'm going to regret this.
We had to look very hard for this piece.
Went down, the lights were on.
We had heard about this joke, and it took us a long time to find a visual image of it.
A top executive at one of America's biggest power companies.
There is an image in here of a rather famous woman, and I'm going to ask that we get call my office so I can do it in the audio tape, who ultimately, was killed in the Iraq War. She's a very famous activist. Now, at a lot of screenings, when Jeff Skilling gets a pie in his face, there's a lot of cheering. It really is an extraordinary moment. In fact, when the film played in Houston, and it played throughout the summer of 2005, there was a lot of attendance there, and it played very much like the Rocky Horror Picture Show. People would come and scream at the screen. Well, in California, it's not surprising that people were equally exercised. I think that Californians didn't really appreciate or understand, and it's hard to know how they could have, just how badly their state had been manipulated and taken advantage of. Now, this is the episode about Schwarzenegger, Lay, Bush, and Gray Davis, which ultimately ends in the recall of Gray Davis. the fact is, this was not a conspiracy hatched in a boardroom someplace, but it shows the way the influence works. Everybody in this troika.
His friend George W. Bush became...
And by the way, Mike Milken was also at that secret meeting. Mike Milken, we remember from the Predators Ball and an earlier era of corruption and excess. But all the people involved in that meeting, either in the room or outside it, George Bush, Ken Lay, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Mike Milken, they were radical advocates of total deregulation. And so it was all about reinforcing each other and helping when they could to make sure that their opponents, and Gray Davis in this sense was an opponent, would be demonized and hopefully replaced. And after all, Gray Davis at the time was a stated candidate for president. So these things, I think, don't work as the conspiracy theorists would like us to think they do. It's a confluence of interests. And the beauty of this particular moment was that our president, George W. Bush, didn't have to do anything. All he had to do was do nothing. And as Gray Davis said, that's something he did very well. And Arnold Schwarzenegger then could profit from that moment.
Respect, Mr. President, our law said the federal government regulates.
So
it is your problem.
That's the way that the stewardship of the seventh largest economy in the world changes. It's kind of staggering, really, where you see how money and politics work, not always in a purely conspiratorial way, but in ways that ultimately add up to the same thing. Now, here's an interesting correction I'd like to make. Here's Pat Wood, who was recommended to the FERC by Ken Lay, to his pal George Bush. But the fact of the matter is, by the time he was confirmed at FERC, Wood really didn't have an opportunity to have an effect one way or another on the energy crisis. That's a small correction I'd like to make. It is a fact that once the Democrats took charge of the Senate because Jim Jeffords decided to leave the Republican Party, that everything did change.
Hello.
It's one of those only...
I love that hello. There's something, you just never know exactly what you're going to get in an answer. When Gray Davis said hello, it seemed at once so California and so... I wish in a way that Gray Davis had responded as spontaneously as that while he had been governor. He might still be governor today.
Now it's time we terminate Gray Davis.
See, I think Ken Lay and indirectly George Bush gave Arnold Schwarzenegger the key to how to attack Gray Davis.
Phony energy crisis as a result of deregulation.
And that's what he rode to the governor's mansion.
Governor, as a result of deregulation. Never would have come.
Gray Davis was put in deeper trouble by the fact that the federal government, which was then run by George Bush, didn't intervene. It's not a conspiracy, but it might as well have been. Here I'd like to say a little something about Matt Hauser's score. In addition to the music, Matt Hauser's score is so beautiful and poignant and powerful, very unobtrusive, but conveys a sense of the gravity of the Enron story, the mystery of it, and the sense that this film is a little bit like a heist film. It has a kind of film noir quality that I love about it. I think Matt did an extraordinary job. The Reverend that you just saw, Reverend Nutter, as it turns out, ran a church not very far from where I go in the summers in Maine, something I didn't know at the time. He was a powerful character, Nutter, because he had heard testimony from so many different Enron employees and really had a sense. It was like talking to Nutter was like talking to hundreds of Enron employees.
He looked back at me and he said, "Yeah, Amanda, you're most likely right."
Now, here's Amanda who really did have, I think, a sense of perspective and understanding about Skilling himself.
Had taken over the asylum.
I can't say at the end of the day that I was sympathetic to Jeff Skilling, but there are moments when I understood his pain at the very least. Because Enron, I think, he believed was his invention, or at least Enron as it ultimately came to be. And it must have been very hard for him to see it go wrong. And yet where I lose sympathy for Jeff Skilling is where he puts himself in that moment where he says, I am Enron. And it's all about him. At the end of the day, he was the custodian of a public company that had thousands of employees. It's hard for me to imagine that Dwight D. Eisenhower, before the invasion of Normandy, would have said, I am the U.S. Army. But Skilling, I think, took it too personally and didn't have enough of a sense of what it is to be a leader. And so when the going got tough, Jeff got going, but in a different way. Got going right out of Enron.
I had informed the company that I was going to downgrade the stock on Skilling's resignation. I asked Jeff Skilling, are there any more shoes to drop? Have we seen the worst of it? And I was concerned about the energy crisis.
It's hard to parse this one because in some ways Skilling, and that's a beautiful photograph of him, that strange, almost weepy eye. In some ways, after the bankruptcy, he came on so strong when he goes before the Senate and the House and testifies as nobody else did. But at this moment, even though he cites personal reasons, his departure was so inelegant, so abrupt, so selfish, ultimately.
Mr. Skilling, a massive earthquake struck Enron right after your departure. And people in far inferior positions to you could see cracks in the walls, feel the tremors, feel the windows rattling. And you want us to believe that you sat there in your office and had no clue that this place was about to collapse.
Now here he is, Jeff Skilling, looking world-weary at having to answer this question over and over and over again, as if saying, of course, I didn't know that anything was wrong at Enron. But he was one of the smartest guys in the room. I think he must have had an inkling. But I don't think anybody knew, including Jeff Skilling, how quickly Enron was going to fall. And in fact, it fell as quickly as it did, in part because of the mechanisms put in place by Andy Fastow, who had propped up the company, but propped it up in a way that would make it go down very quickly. Now, here's a moment where you can say some good things about Ken Lay. I mean, he takes over at a moment when it seems like it's a very dark time for the company, and does so in a way that garners a lot of support from the employees who really felt very fondly toward him at this moment. But where he goes wrong and where, and this is the heart of the criminal prosecution against him, is where he starts to make some rather extraordinary comments about the company, as if to say the company's never been in better shape. In fact, he says that very thing.
We're not the only stock that's decreased in value this year. It's just that we've been hit a little harder than many others. If a few of these other problems...
Few of these other little problems like California and India. Yeah, little problems.
The worst is over, and I'm excited.
August 14th, 2001, Jeff Skilling abruptly resigns. And that made me angry. It made loads of employees angry.
Now, Sharon Watkins is a very interesting character.
I mean, this was, Jim Jones feeding us the Kool-Aid and then deciding not to drink it himself.
Now, Kool-Aid, I should say, has a very important metaphorical role at Enron. A lot of people said if they were real advocates of Jeff Skilling, they would say about them, he's drunk the Kool-Aid.
Identify your counsel for the committee.
Yes, my counsel is Mr. Philip Hilder.
Now, this is a very important hearing, this hearing where Sharon Watkins goes before the Congress. I think Sharon was thrust into the public limelight. Many people have derisively referred to her as a whistleblower. Some people have lionized her as a whistleblower. I think she herself would say that she wasn't a whistleblower in the sense that she never went to an outside agency first.
By the information I was receiving.
It's also interesting to look at these. This is a detail that we weren't able to put into the film, but in those hearings, there were two hearings, one in the House and one in the Senate with Sharon Watkins. The one in the House happened first. The one in the Senate felt that they had been robbed of their moment in the sun, so they had to do something to top it. So what they did was they invited Jeff Skilling to sit right next to, or at least one person away from Sharon Watkins, to give that Senate hearing a little bit more oomph, a little bit more drama. It turns out that the Senate likes a good skit every bit as much as the executives at Enron.
Fastow had gambled Enron's future.
Now, here are the numbers, going back to the numbers again. There's something magical about the numbers, always the numbers. Now, this is the letter that got so much attention. Because she wrote to Lay. Like I was saying before, she didn't go to the SEC or an outside agency. So I think Sharon Watkins would say that she wasn't a whistleblower in the classic sense. But she did have a sense, possibly because she came into Andy Fastow's department after so much had happened, that something was deeply wrong, and she wrote a letter to her president about it. Now, this is an interesting exchange where they're talking about Cliff Baxter. One of the things that came out in Sharon Lay's letter was that Cliff Baxter had had conversations with Skilling about Andy Fastow. This suggested in some ways that Baxter was signaling Skilling that something was wrong, that Fastow was a problem, so that Skilling couldn't have been unaware of it. And it also showed that Cliff Baxter had a deeply moral streak, I think. But at the end of the day, it may have been something that contributed to the enormous amount of public attention that Baxter gotten, and may have, in part, led to a suicide.
People don't really appreciate what she did and the bravery that it took in that company.
I think Mimi's right. I think her bravery was extraordinary.
In the Enron candy jar without
But it's not unalloyed. I mean, she had her own reasons for doing what she did. There was a certain amount of self-interest there. But at the end of the day, to rudder against the culture at Enron was so hard. In fact, when she told the story to her lawyer originally, her lawyer could barely believe. She, the half of him thought she might have been a little unhinged, because she was suggesting that a company the size and reputation of something like GE was corrupt at the core.
Probably in more normal circumstances, I would have had a few more words to say about September the 11th. Just like America's under attack by terrorism, I think we're under attack.
Now, if that doesn't testify to the Enron delusion, to the Enron dimension, that strange parallel universe, I don't know what was. How could you compare the attack on the Twin Towers of September 11th to Enron's corporate troubles? That remains staggering to me.
Billions in mark-to-market profits were really losses.
This Wall Street Journal article was very important, and I'm glad we were able to include it, because it was one of the first times that the enormity of the fraud at Enron was glimpsed. Now, the strongest they've ever been. Here is Lay, talking about how great the company is. It's a little hard to believe that he's doing this at this moment in time.
The inquiry will take a lot of time on the part of our accountants and lawyers and others. But it will finally put these issues to rest.
Well, clearly didn't.
Was talking to employees. Only a few blocks away, Enron's accounting firm, Arthur Andersen, had begun destroying its Enron.
There's a lot of talk about the recent Supreme Court decision to overthrow the Arthur Andersen conviction. I'm not going to comment on the legal merits of the original case or the overthrow of the conviction, but it seems to me that the amount of shredding that went on at Andersen, whether legal or illegal, testifies to some sense that they felt there was clearly something very, very wrong.
The company's in the best shape it's ever been in.
Now, from the standpoint of Enron stock, we're going to bring it back.
Ken Lay had a vested interest in bringing that stock back.
And I've got a few up here. I would like to know if you are on crack.
I've always wondered about this question. Did he just get handed that question? Did they not screen that question? Or did they decide that it was a good idea to read that question about crack?
Anyone at Enron, much less anyone outside of Enron, it wasn't really clear what was going on or what was going to happen.
I know there's a lot of speculation about Andy's involvement.
There's Andy.
Are also sure that Andy has operated in the most ethical and appropriate manner possible.
The next day, Andy Fastow was fired.
Right.
discovered that he had made more than $45 million from his LJN partnerships.
Question, Mr. Fastow.
Now, here comes the role of Andy Fastow. We won't really know what the relationship between Fastow, Skilling, and Lay was like until after the trial. At the moment, it's Lay and Skilling's position that Fastow was a deeply bad character who single-handedly brought Enron down. Andy Fastow, I suspect, will have a lot to say about that, because I think there's a part of Andy Fastow that believes that he was a good soldier who, while he may have paid himself well for his soldiering, he nonetheless did, in a large sense, the bidding of Skilling and Lay by dressing up the books to make it look like Enron was a great company.
I've thought about this, and it couldn't have just been a few executives at Enron.
This is one of my favorite moments in the film, where you have a sense of all this publicity, these flashbulbs going off, as if they've got the perp. But all the flashbulbs are shedding light on what is really a kind of diversion, because it's not about Andy Fastow, really, or even Jeff Lay, or even Ken Lay, or even Jeff Skilling. It's ultimately about something much bigger that the flashbulbs are missing, which is that Enron is just a kind of poster child for a larger flaw in American culture, a sense that so long as you're making money, it's okay, a kind of winner-take-all culture that Ken Lay represented as well as anybody. And yet, at the end, when Enron goes down, suddenly no one's standing up and saying, I take responsibility, despite the fact that he uses those very words, Ken Lay. Suddenly, it's all about casting blame.
Like the wonderful movie Chicago, I was reminded of the puppet strings and
The allusion to Chicago is a good one, because it's all about a diversion.
I mean, everybody's...
I think what makes Enron so important is its glimpse into this culture, in which, on the one hand, you can believe you're the smartest guy in the room when everything's going well, and when everything craters, suddenly it's not your fault. Not only is it not your fault, but somehow you're a victim. Ken Lay down to his last $20 million.
Shot as a crook or as an idiot.
I believe the only venue for me is the Ride of Broken Dreams.
Oh, you mean the Enron ride? Let's go.
Enron hit the national site.
Yes. Once again, nothing encapsulates a larger issue better than The Simpsons.
We're all gonna be rich!
We broke even!
It is my belief that Enron's failure was due to a classic run on the bank.
Now, we included this footage of It's a Wonderful Life because it seemed a nice juxtaposition, the idea of a small savings and loan, the ultimate small business, juxtaposed with Enron, the ultimate big business, seventh largest corporation in America.
On December 2nd, 2001, less than...
there was also a run on the bank in It's a Wonderful Life, as if somehow Skilling was recalling that sort of bedrock, mythic images of American business when he talks about a run on the bank, as if Enron was very much in the mainstream. And in a funny way, I think Skilling was right. Enron was very much in the mainstream of American business.
Long gone, and we were just now on the sinking ship.
More Titanic imagery, morphing into the Lusitania.
And at that point, it was no longer...
You can almost see the pools of water on the sidewalks of Houston.
On the Lusitania. The torpedo had hit, and there's 20 minutes to get out.
Once again, Matt Hauser's music is so beautiful here. These images of all these boxes. For the first time, all this talk about I am Enron, all the talk about the great executives, the big ideas. For the first time, now suddenly, with Enron going down, you see the carnage, because at its heart, a company like Enron is a social institution. It's a group of people who are trying to bond together to make a living.
And it was very eerie.
And now it's a ghost town. Power trading.
Mr. Skilling, your opening.
Look, I love that shot. His gaze goes skyward in some way that's almost unhinged.
Tape, and I believe we have it ready to go. Listen to this.
Should we invest all of our 401k in Enron stock? Absolutely. Don't you guys agree?
Yes. I think everybody found this moment to be very powerful.
You had begun unloading your stock. Pretty heavy.
Now, the issue of unloading stock is at the heart of the government's case against Jeff Skilling and Ken Lay to some extent. I should say very clearly that this film is in no way an attempt to parse legal guilt or innocence, but it is a kind of morality tale. And in that sense, we can look at what a few executives got from Enron and how badly their employees and their shareholders were treated. And in that, there is, I think, a very dark moral shadow.
$348,000, and I sold it all for $1,200 was what I got for it when it was done.
There is some dispute on a factual basis as to whether or not, Al Kesswetter's recollection of exactly when Enron stock is frozen was correct or not. The fact remains that whatever the numbers were, it was frozen, and there was a lot of disagreement at the time as to what the rules were about withdrawing your money. It's also a fact that other employees actually doubled down and bought more Enron stock. But I think the more fundamental issue is the fact that there's a tremendous knowledge gap between what employees and shareholders know versus what the insiders know at the top about exactly what the health of a company is. And for that, there is a cautionary tale for all of us. But there's also a real imbalance of power here between those who know how to operate the levers of the financial machine and those who don't. A lot of people tell me that the film at the end makes them very angry. Well, I can't blame them. The story made me very angry too. I hope that people get angry at this film. In a way, I'm mystified that more people aren't angrier about what happened at Enron and demand more accountability from their government and from their business leaders. If that were to happen, then the film were to play some small part in that, I would feel very good. The other thing, particularly in terms of the California scandal, I would hope that people would look at the California scandal and become very angry about it, but also they would reflect on it and realize how hard it is, but how important it is to really look at publicity campaigns and to pierce them and to ask tough questions about them. Because the lesson of the California story for me is that Enron tried very hard to create the impression that there was absolutely nothing wrong, even though the state was literally going up in flames. At that point, people owe it to themselves not only to get angry, but to demand answers.
We were very close for many years.
We've talked about some of the reflections in Enron, one side, the other side. And I think in Cliff Baxter's story, as briefly as we tell it here, there is also that kind of flip side of the mirror. On the one hand, there was how good he felt about himself when Enron was riding high, and there was how bad he felt about himself when Enron was so discredited. Here's the final wrap-up of what happened to the three key characters, Fastow, Skilling, and Lay. There's one story that I wanted to include here at the end, and it just didn't seem to work, but it is interesting to talk about. There was a period while Skilling was waiting for trial where he was caught in New York on a street corner after he had tried to rip open a woman's blouse looking for an FBI microphone. He had been staying up very late, he was drunk, and he'd become extremely paranoid and out of control, trying to rip off the license plate of this woman to prove, who she was. And he ended up in the middle of the street, his arms thrust back, screaming at the sky. I always found that a very poignant image. Now, to some extent, it may have been just a drunken evening, but it testified, I think, to a moment when he had become unhinged, when it was impossible to keep the contradictions of Enron stable in his mind, looking at the sky and screaming at it.
Enron's accounting firm, Arthur Andersen, was convicted of obstructing justice. With its reputation for honesty...
By the way, for those who'd like to check out that, Skilling's lawyers dispute the fact, or the facts as I relayed them, on that evening in New York City. There are a number of newspaper clippings that people could check out through Google. It's an interest, and also the court rendered its decision about how it was going to force Skilling to do more community service and to be more restrictive about the terms of his bail.
Today's arrest of Ken Lay, the top echelon at Enron, has now...
This was a sequence in the film that at one time we had at the very beginning. We had a long sequence relating to Ken Lay's arrest and arraignment at the very beginning of the film. It shows how films are sometimes put together where the very thing that you think is most powerful at the beginning ends up being something so important to put at the end. It's hard to know going into a documentary exactly how it's going to turn out, and yet the one thing you learn over time is to trust that in the end you will find a way.
I think the larger lesson was what Enron asked of its employees, which was ask why.
I'm so glad we ended the film with Colin because he asks the most poignant and most powerful questions in a way that I think connects the story to all of us. Watching the finished film after a very long period of time, even as I'm doing this commentary, reminds me just what a long and winding road it was to get to the final place we got to. I think that's one thing I've learned over time, is to put your faith in the notion that when you start out on a film and a documentary, it's going to be a long journey and it's going to be a long and winding road, but that sooner or later you'll get to the place you need or want to be, mostly by following the story. At some point, the story tells you where to go, and it's at your peril if you don't listen to that, and you start cutting out the things that don't make sense and doing everything that you can to undergird the character of the story and also the characters who appear in that story. They begin to guide you along the way. And of course, it's always useful to have a very skilled editor and producers assisting you to remind you of how egregiously you wander off the path from time to time. It is interesting to reflect on why documentaries are gaining so much popularity now. I have a theory about it. I don't know if it's as good or better or worse than anybody else's, but I think one of the reasons documentaries are popular is that people, ironically enough, have become conditioned through reality television, as odd as it may sound, to accept the idea that stories without actors can be dramatic. And indeed, they turn out sometimes to be far more surprising than scripted tales, because scripted tales sometimes, through the development process that's so common in Hollywood, tend to become somewhat predictable. And documentaries have a kind of unpredictable quality to them. At the same time, I'll say that I wouldn't say fiction's dead. In fact, fiction's alive and well and living inside the documentary. And what I mean by that is that I think that documentary filmmakers have learned a lot from fiction filmmakers about character, narrative momentum, drama, and a sense of shaping and sculpting stories in ways that are like fiction films. And yet, they have materials that are very much more unpredictable than some of the drama you see. So I think they have the best of both worlds. The Enron film was the culmination of many films I've done before, either as a producer or as a director. There are some things that unite them. One was the use of music, a kind of storytelling style, an affection for black humor, and a deep interest in power and how it's used and abused. That's something that I focused on in a film that I made with Eugene Jarecki called The Trials of Henry Kissinger. Also in a series of films I made for television called The 50s, we looked a lot at those themes and also played a lot with this role of music, this sense of a toe-tapping Greek chorus. You know, I feel very strongly as a music fan about the power that music has and how it can be used well in films. This is Alex Gibney. I've talked long enough. Thank you very much for listening.